Welcome back to another episode. In this video I'm gonna review another classic from the good old days, Blue Max for the Commodore 64. And let's go! Blue Max is an isometric shoot-'em-up in the style of Saxon. It was developed by a company called Synapse Software, also known as Synsoft, and it was published by either Synapse Software, US Gold and Areola Soft, depending on in which country it was released in. The game was released in 1983, first for the Atari 8-bit computers like the Atari 400, the 800, the XE and the XL, and also in the same year it was also released for the Commodore 64, and 1 year later, in 1984, it was released for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum computers. In this game you take control of a pilot called Max Chatsworth from the Royal Air Force during World War I. Your task is to destroy a number of specific targets while flying over enemy lines, and after you accomplish that, make a final assault on 3 special targets within the city, which are supposed to be the German Reichstag. With your biplane you always start on an Allied airfield. The plane will accelerate as soon as you press the fire button, or shortly after the refueling process is completed. The plane must at least reach 100 miles per hour in order to take off. Once in the air you are in enemy territory, and basically everything is a viable target, at least for points. Enemy planes, tanks, anti-aircraft batteries, ships, vehicles, buildings and bridges. Flashing planes, vehicles, ships and buildings or bridges with a flashing X on top of them are your primary targets, and you have to destroy a certain amount of those in order to attack the Reichstag. As weapons you have machine guns with unlimited ammunition and 30 bombs. Pressing the fire button will fire the machine guns. To drop bombs you have to push the joystick down and press the fire button. Pushing the joystick to the left or to the right will of course steer your plane either to the left or to the right side. To climb you push up, and to descend you push down. You can also move your plane forward and backward by pushing up and left or down and right. Below the game screen is the control bar. On the left side you can see the altitude and the speed of the plane. Right next to them you have a display which lets you know if an enemy plane is approaching by displaying the letter P. Strong winds, which will influence your controls, will be displayed with the letter W, and the letter L appears if you approach an Allied runway. Then we also have a fuel gauge, a bomb counter, the high score, and above the high score we have the damage display. Every time your plane gets hit by an anti-aircraft gun, your plane gets damaged. An F stands for a fuel leak, which means that you lose twice as much fuel as normally. A B stands for damaged bomb gear, which means that sometimes dropping a bomb works and sometimes it doesn't. An M stands for decreased maneuverability, and a G stands for damaged machine guns, which means that they will only fire if they feel like it. The plane will crash if all 4 damages are displayed and it gets hit one more time by the anti-aircraft guns. And finally, right next to the damage display is the, let's call it, enemy plane altitude arrow. This arrow will only appear if an enemy plane is nearby, and it tells you if you are on a higher or lower altitude than the enemy plane. If you are at the same altitude as the enemy plane, the whole control bar will turn blue. Now you are able to shoot down the enemy plane, but be careful because now you can also collide with it, which will always end in a crash. The control bar will also change to a brown color if you are flying between 21 to 25 feet. It indicates that you are on strafing altitude. Now you can attack ground targets with your machine guns. If you fly below 21 feet, the control bar will turn yellow, indicating that you are too low and you will collide with every ground object. The game is more or less divided in sections rather than levels. Each section has a slightly different scenery. One time you fly over a forest right next to a river, another time you fly most of the section over the river, and in another you follow a road to enemy airfields, and so on. At the end of each section lies an allied airfield, where you should always land at least to refuel, since your plane has only enough fuel for a little bit more than one section. Try to land at the beginning of the runway so that you have enough room left afterwards for the takeoff. After you landed, your plane gets immediately refueled. After the refueling, your bombs will be reloaded, and then the repair work start if your plane has been damaged. Each damage will be repaired separately and in order from the right to the left side. So first the guns, then the controls, then the bomb gear, and lastly the fuel leak. The plane will accelerate again after the refueling and the repair works are completed, but you can take off at any time by pressing the fire button. And sometimes you have to take off before the repair works or refueling is completed, because you are completely defenseless on the runway and enemy planes will use this opportunity to bomb your plane. Pressing F3 on the keyboard at the intro screen will bring up the option menu, and you also switch through the options by pressing F3. With F5 you can change the options. In the options you can turn on gravity, which means that your plane will constantly lose altitude and you have to compensate that. Next you can change the controls from normal to pilot, which reverses the up and down controls. And finally you can change the difficulty: beginner, advanced or expert. The game is always set on beginner, but honestly I didn't notice much of a difference in the higher difficulty levels. The only differences that I could found were that in beginner you have to destroy 7 primary targets in order to advance to the city bomb section. In advanced you have to destroy 8 targets, and in expert you have to destroy 9 targets. And in this difficulty level also some of the ships will shoot at you. But basically that's it. I was actually surprised that you don't really feel a difference like in most every other game, where you would increase the difficulty and the enemies/opponents were now, let's say, better drivers, better soldiers, better pilots, or they make more damage or whatever. But this is not something that I would criticize, because technically it is harder to destroy 8 or 9 primary targets than 7, and of course that ships can also shoot at you in expert. Also, the game is actually pretty hard even on beginner, since beside the fact that you can take up to 4 hits from the anti-aircraft guns, which can happen pretty quickly, the game will constantly push you until you make a mistake, and then it's game over. You only have 1 life. Every contact except with the runway will cause a crash, and the game can also become super frustrating when primary targets start to appear which are completely out of your range/impossible to hit. Also sometimes the game will give you only a couple of primary targets, and if you didn't manage to destroy all or most of them, they stop appearing, which means that you can still continue with your game, but you can't finish it anymore. In the end, like I said before, it is a pretty hard game. I had it back in the days as a kid, I guess in 1987. I loved it, even though I never beat it back then. I actually didn't knew that, you could finish the game. I thought it was one of those games where it's all about the high score, and today, almost 30 years later, I still like it a lot. And I was finally able to beat it while I was working on this review. The graphics in my opinion are average, because I know the Commodore 64 is capable of more, but they still look great, especially because of the isometric view. The controls are very responsive, and the sound effects during the game and the little intro music are also very good. Lumex is a very good shoot 'em up that I would highly recommend to fans of those kind of games slash who are fans of shooters. It is a classic and very well known among Commodore 64 veterans, and I've mentioned in the beginning that the game was also released for the Atari 8-bit computers and the ZX Spectrum computers. Now, I've never played any of those versions, but I also watched a couple of videos before I made this review, and I just wanted to see if there are any major differences in those versions. In the end, for the most part, they are more or less identical to the Commodore 64 version. I mean, graphically they look a little bit different, of course, because of the capabilities of the systems. Now, the Atari version looks to me like Atari 2600/5200 game. Not bad or anything, but yeah, the graphics reminded me more of those machines. And the only real differences that I could found while watching those videos was that, number one, the screen, or let's say the play field in the Atari version looked to me a little bit bigger, so you had more space to maneuver in the Atari version, which might make the game a little bit easier. But on the other hand, what I also saw was that also the enemy planes will shoot at you, so this might be another thing that makes the Atari version a little bit harder. But anyways, in the end, what I've saw about the Atari version, it also looked like a very fun and good shoot 'em up game, and I guess I can also recommend the Atari version. And yeah, the ZX Spectrum version, I'm not that familiar with the Spectrum computers. The system has the color limitations, let's call it like that, so for me almost any Spectrum computer game looks almost the same, at least for me. But yeah, from what I've seen, it is almost completely identical to the Commodore 64 version, except of course the graphics. But in the end, I also think that the Spectrum version of the game is actually a pretty good shoot 'em up, especially for the Spectrum computers. But in the end, like I said, I never played those versions before. Okay, but now we're at the end of my review of Lumex for the Commodore 64. I hope you enjoyed the show. Maybe see you next time. Take care. Bye!